Okay, in this video, let's take a look at the second scene here, which is going to be the animation of the line chart, and we will also talk about how to work with syncing animation up to audio. So here is what we're going to go through.
Over the past 5 years, the average cost has increased by 30%, outpacing inflation.
Okay, so kind of a lot going on here in just a few seconds. So we essentially have we're back to our sort of blank canvas that we ended up on at the end of the last video. And we have the chart kind of like growing onto the screen and these numbers popping onto the screen. And then the big one here is we have this line chart growing and kind of following the graph as it goes up. The other important thing to look at here is how we can work with audio, which we did not do last time. So let's go ahead and start a new composition for this example. Bring my settings over here. We'll call this graph 1 example. These settings are correct. I'm going to go ahead and leave our background color gray just so we remember to place a solid background color that's the one that we want. And we will start by actually pull that in so we can just grab that color easily. So we're in our new comp. I'm going to double click on the rectangle tool to create a new solid that's the same size as the canvas. I'm going to hold Option or Alt and click on the stroke to cycle through the options until I have no stroke. And because this, remember the last color I was using, I can actually delete that title card. Rename this by hitting enter in this background, and then I'm going to lock it and mark it to hide it when I need to. Okay, so we have this started. Before we get too far into the line chart, I also want to chat about audio, and I would suggest doing this on its own composition. That way you can kind of pull it into your different scenes as you need to. So we've set up our graph 1 example. Now we're going to set up another composition as an example. And you can see here I've pulled my recorded audio into my project folder. I also have that sitting in my project folder actually on my computer. So make sure you keep all your files together here. So I'm going to click on that. I'm going to go right click, new comp from selection. Just another way to pull, this file into a new composition. And then I'm going to rename this composition audio example. So a lot of the tricks that I am using in here I actually learned a while ago from a great School of Motion video. I will link to that because there's plenty of more good tips in that, but just to give you kind of a source of where this is coming from. So you can see we have our audio here. If I hit play,
The cost of childcare in the U.S. is rising.
You can hear the audio playing. So I've already gone ahead and synced this up to the first scene. I'm just going to show you how I'm working with this in this second scene. But to see, we want our animation to play along with the audio and for there to be a relationship between those two things. So it's important that we're animating at the right times in the audio, especially with something like music. If you're using that to drive the rhythm or the movement in the piece, in the pacing, it's important that you're able to see where those things are happening. So a trick here is if I have my layer selected, if I hit L on my keyboard, or I can unfold this here, I can see the waveforms, but to get there you hit L. You can also get there by just untwirling audio all the way down. And then you can see your waveforms, and this gives you a nice visual representation of where certain things are happening in the audio. So like here, if I go ahead and play,
The cost of childcare.
You can see that these first 2 seconds are silence of the recording, and I just recorded this on my phone in a quiet room. And then here is where that first sentence, the cost of childcare, starts. What we're going to do here is place some markers along this audio file. That way when we pull it into the scenes we're animating with it, we can see where certain things are happening. So this little icon over here looks like a bookmark or like an extra playhead. If you click on it and you drag it out, it lets you place a marker. And you can see that if I move my playhead, that marker stays there, and so I can see that something is happening there. If I jump back to my example, so this is graph 1, and I pull that audio example into here, what's nice is that marker stays there. And so we know at this point in the animation, that audio starts, and we can sync that up to a certain movement that we want to animate to. So going back to the example, we're going to double click on this, and you can change the title of this. So we can say over the past 5 years, and that's what we know is starting there. Really, for this scene, what we want is that second part.
Less is rising. Over the past...
Oops, actually, this is not what this should be called. This should be called the cost of childcare is rising. Is the first part there. The one we want, and why I was thinking of that, is this is over the past 5 years. And that's really where we want to start the second scene.
Over the past 5 years, the average cost has increased by 30%, outpacing inflation.
And if we had something we wanted to talk about the inflation portion, we could include that here. And you can just go on and kind of include those markers in your audio file. So that's how to tell where the audio is and how to sync up your animation. And you'll see if oh, you know what, maybe I need to refresh this somehow or re-pull this in here. There you go. So you can see our markers in here. So I can actually trim this down to where it starts over the past 5 years, because this is from the scene before. I can pull that out to the front somewhere. So now we have our background and we have our audio in here. The next thing is to start animating that line chart. And it's probably easiest to get the whole thing on here to sort of like, you know, place all of our elements where we want to end up, and then place some keyframes and then move backwards and kind of animate them on. So the next thing I want to look at here is how to get this path on here, because everything is kind of oriented around this path. Or I guess I could start with the lines here too. But I want to show you a kind of a trick or a shortcut to getting complex paths like this that you might be working with in Illustrator. So we know we can export Illustrator files and open them up in After Effects. You can certainly do that here. Because I just have this one chart in Illustrator, I don't have a bunch of layers that I need to port over. There is a quick way, or kind of a cheat, to getting that path copied into here. So I grab Illustrator and pull it over here. You can see, and I could increase the stroke here so you can see it. I have this line chart that I traced from my source, and I just pulled it into Illustrator and used the trace feature to get a clean line that's in an SVG format. If I select this in Illustrator and I hit Command-C or Control-C to copy it, I can actually paste that path into After Effects with some tricks. So the trick here is to make sure that you create a shape layer and that there's a path inside of that. Actually, the easiest way to do this is probably to start a path with the pen tool. So I deleted that. I've grabbed my pen tool and I'm just going to click. So you can see if I open this, there's now a shape. Inside the shape layer, I have a path. If I untwirl that path, I can select the path. So it's just a single point right now, but if I hit Command V, you can see that that path is pasted into the path in After Effects, and I can scale this up and work with it just like I would with any other element in After Effects. So there is our path. So I'm going to change the color here. Let me perhaps grab our design board briefly and scale this way down. Just cheating to grab the color off of here. So I've selected my path, grab my stroke, and then I'm just going to use the color picker to pick that blue over here. And then I can get rid of this, and we can continue to work with this to tweak it to our liking. I think something like 2 pixels is probably good. Not sure how far up I want to scale this. Let's start here. I'm then going to use my alignment panel just to center this up, both vertically and horizontally. I'm going to rename it because we always rename it. Line chart path. And then let's start working on some of those other things. So for example, the axes. So I can just draw those on here just to give the viewer a point of reference. This doesn't need to be huge. Now I'm even going to scale that one down a little more so it's not quite as prominent as the graph itself. That looks pretty small. Let's stay with 2. So there's our axis. We need to add our source in. So we're going to work with some text layers and then our data points. Actually, let's add those points in first. So I'm highlighting my shape tool, grabbing ellipse. I'm going to zoom in here by holding Command and using the scroll wheel. And then I have my shape tool, and I'm going to hold Command and Shift as I draw this so that it constrains the proportions to be a perfect circle and it scales it from the center. So I'm going to again hold Alt and cycle through the fill to get to a solid color, and we want that solid color to be this light blue, and then I'm going to pull the stroke off. Ooh, that dot's pretty big. I'm going to scale that down quite a bit. Oops. So the reason this is moving when it's scaling is because you can see the anchor point is centered in the layer. So what we need to do is go to Layer, we go to Transform, Center Anchor Point in Layer Contents. You can see how that's snapped over here to the point. So I'm going to scale this down quite a bit. Point elements, let me name my axes and lock that. Point elements capture our attention pretty quickly. So let me rename that point to point 1. And because it doesn't want me to select it, I'm going to pull it on top. We could also use, for example, if I hit P, I can get my position, and then I can use the, oops, looks like I renamed these wrong. Okay. Let's back up here. This is the axis. This is the point. So point, axis, lock that. Let's go ahead and hide some of this stuff just to clean up the workspace. So using the shy feature, now I can select that and drag it where I want it. So if we zoom out, you can see that still looks pretty big in reference to the line itself. And so I'm going to go ahead and leave it that size. I'm going to clarify this with point 1, and then I'm going to use Command D to duplicate it so that I have another point the exact same size. And that one I'm going to move over here to the end. And I just like to zoom in to make sure that I am keeping everything accurate. You can see how this wants to snap to the edge of that frame. And so instead of using the mouse here, I'm going to click and drag the position over in the layer properties directly. Okay, so there's our axis, there's our points. The other thing we need to add here are those text layers. So I can grab my text tool, click and drag down here. I'm not sure what size this is going to default to, but let's shrink it down because I don't trust it. And in that layer, I can type source Axios, the other supplemental data. I want this to be a little less prominent, and so I'm going to use, I think I used the serif in the design board. I think I used like a light italic. Maybe, I could be wrong here, I could go back and check. Graph 1, so I used that, and then I used a, looks like a regular weight. The light is okay too, I like this here. So let's get that positioned. I need to reference my numbers here. So 2019, 530, 2023, 700. Let's do our years first. And I'm going to do these all on separate layers. Let's go ahead and type 2019. That I want to change the typographic hierarchy here because I want there to be a system that the viewer can tell the different type treatments are referencing different things. So I'm going to set that to regular. Oops, I set source code. We want source sans. And then maybe this gets scaled up a little bit to something like, I don't know, let's try 32. We might decide that's a little large, but for now, that works. And then I'm just going to duplicate this with Command D. You can see it tries to rename this to 2022. We'll have to rename that. And then I'm just going to move it over so I can easily grab it and position this above that. Oops, I'll scale it. This is why I like to work with the property numbers over here. Over here, let's see. Oh, we put that below on this one. That's okay too. So something like that for now. So there's our years. And then let's get our dollar values in here too. In fact, I don't want to do it like that. Let me grab new text layer. I'll do it up here just so we can see it and then easily position it. And this I want it to be even larger and a little bit, probably a little bit bolder. So let's consider like doubling this to something like 60. And you can see when I position that, it gives a very clear hierarchy that these three things are different sources of information. But I do think this is too big, so let's go down to maybe not 40, I don't know, that's 50. That looks pretty good. We're pretty close to what we have. So let me just work with this composition a little bit to get this to kind of spacing that I like. Again, using that layer transform, center anchor points. You'll end up doing this a lot when you're working with aligning things. So now I can hold shift, select these two things, and then align them to each other by centering them and kind of work with them as a group. So if I was smart, I would have created one of these and then duplicated it and just changed the numbers for the second one. That way my spacing was all even, but I wasn't here, so I can always kind of eyeball it, but I would recommend ensuring your spacing is even. It's pretty close. This one's a little further down. Okay, so this one's 700. Oops. And then we want to make sure that we change our year to 2023. When I hit escape, it doesn't confirm it, so make sure you just clicking out of it with a different tool. Okay, and there is our composition. Now we just need to animate it. Okay, so our composition's set up, and now from here we just need to animate everything onto the screen. So we will take those one at a time, and maybe I will do them in the order that we're thinking about them coming onto the screen. So just as a reference, here's our graph again. If I scrub through this, you can see that our, oops, let me mute that so I can talk over it. You can see that the elements pop up here, the dot in the annotation text label, and then from there we have the axes grow out from the 0 coordinate here. After that, we have the line graph animating where the second point comes on and follows the path, and then we have a similar motion where the text pops up at the end. So let's take those in stride. Let's get our ending keyframes on here, just so we have them all. Everything's kind of timed up for each one. Let me unshy these. Let's look at our axis first. So to get that line to grow out, we are going to use the trim paths effect here. And so I actually need to add that in before we can add any keyframes. So here's my axis. I'm going to add and come down to trim paths. And then if I untwirl the trim paths effect, you can see I have my percentages here for the start, the end, and the offset. And as I scrub down on that end, let me turn my stroke up here just for a second so you can see what it's doing. You can see that that end animates the line from what it's considering the start, or the 0%, which is the top left, down, and then all the way over to the end here. So we actually want it to grow from the middle though. So what I'm going to do is animate both of these. So I'm going to keyframe my start and my end, and then back at the beginning of this scene, I'm going to find the spot where this is right in the corner there. So maybe I animate both of these from, for example, 35%. And when I do that, because the start and the end are at the same point, we don't see it at all on here. But as it goes out, you can see the line grows outwards. And you can see in the layers panel that both the start and the end percentages are changing. The start is moving down towards 0% up here, and the end is moving up towards 100% up here. So there's our line. Let me put this back down to 2 pixels, and let's ease those. I'm going to use F9, or you can right-click and use your keyframe assistant to use Easy Ease. You can kind of finagle the movement of those too, so let's just see.
Over the past 5.
Let me mute this again. See how that looks. So obviously this needs to be much shorter. Maybe we want this to be less than 2 seconds, almost certainly, because the audio is rather quick here. So I move these up here. Let's set our end boundary. I'm using the N key on my keyboard. You can see that sets my work area, and I can watch this loop through. I still think that's a little bit slow considering we want everything else to come up here at the same time. I'm not going to mess with the motion curves because this is a relatively minor part of the scene, and I think that movement is pretty good for that. I might slow down the end just a little bit. It eases out or eases in. Let's start there for now. So we have that. Let's move on to our source here. Maybe, because this is such a small part of this, we could scale that up. In fact, I will. I didn't on the example, but let's layer, transform, center anchor point in layer content. So we're scaling from the center, and let's have that pop on right as the line crosses that origin point. So if I hit S on my keyboard, I bring up the scale here. I'll put a keyframe there for the start, and then by the end, I want this to be at 100%, so keyframe there. I'm going to go back to the first one and set this at 0. Let's see if I ease those, what this looks like. Okay, so that's a little slow for my liking. Let's go ahead and zoom that in. I almost want this to be unnoticeable. This is such a small part of the graph that my goal here is that it calls no attention at all to itself. To accomplish that, it has to follow some of our animation principles, which is why I want it to, appear from somewhere. But I don't want it to linger for so long that the viewer clocks it. Maybe even just 2 keyframes here could be enough. I think I'm going to scoot all these back just a little bit too. Okay, so that's good there. Let's do a similar thing with our 2019 text and the data point. And these ones I want to put a little more focus on. We're going to have to finesse these a little bit because we want the viewer to pay attention to them. So this starts to grow, maybe right around here. I have that point pop on. So I go to 0.1, I open up my scale. Because we scaled this down, this is going to end up at 38%. So we need to keep that number in mind. So I'll place 2 keyframes here, and we will go from 0. Oops, we can go into negatives here, so I'm going to type in 0. Ease those. Let's see what that looks like. I'm also going to, at this point, hide some of these things so we just see what we are working with. Need to set my end boundary there. A little more time to consider that. So it pops on there relatively smoothly. I do think I'm going to, on these more important points, I'm going to add a little bit of overshoot here to give it some bounce. So I want it to actually scale up above that 38% just for a second and then shrink down to it to show that the momentum of that growth actually expands it beyond the endpoint for just a second, and then it shrinks back down. So let's have it actually go to, let's just try 39% and see what that looks like between here and here. Oh, okay, so I see what this is happening. So the keyframe interpolation, you can see that it's going up and then back down. That's a way that it interprets the motion curve between those 2 points. I actually don't like it here, or don't mind it here. But what we could do is go to keyframe interpolation. If you're ever having this issue, you could check some of these. So the Bezier, essentially what this is doing is it's trying to create a smooth curve between this keyframe and this keyframe. So it's overshooting between them. You can see what happens if I set this to auto Bezier. It doesn't quite go up quite as large, it seems like. I actually don't mind it where it is, so I'm gonna undo it and leave it where it was. Kind of like, you can see how it like bounces there. And I'm gonna go ahead and place those same keyframes on the end point so that it follows the same exact motion. And we won't need those till down the line at the end. Or actually, that point is not going to pop on, so scratch that for a second. That point is going to follow along the path, and so we don't need to copy that scaling effect. We do, however, want to replicate it slightly with the text. And I'm going to stagger these motions a little bit so they feel a little more natural. So maybe here we have the date start to pop on, so let's unhide that. And I'm going to hit S for scale. Oops, I didn't want to scale everything, just 2019. Let's keyframe that to 100%, give it a few frames, add our second, and then from here we'll start at 0. And then I want to overshoot that 100% by a little bit. So maybe I go to 105, let's say. See how that looks. I don't like that between here. Maybe this needs a little more time. Oh, it also isn't eased. Could be part of it. So F9 to ease those. That feels a little more natural. So the scale's up, goes all the way up to 105, and then it slightly shrinks down to 100. Maybe we can try even like 110 here. I don't want this to be super noticeable. I accidentally changed all those keyframes. Make sure just this one is selected. There, that gives it a little more bounce. Okay, so because that's working in percentages, we could do the same thing with the dollar value here. So if I hit S for scale and I hit Command V, you can see it pastes those same keyframes in there, and the same thing is happening, or should happen, to that 530 number once we unhide it. I want these to be a little bit more staggered. I don't like that the 530 is coming on at the same time as 2019, because then the I goes straight to the dollar sign and isn't clocking the number at first. So I'm going to offset these by one of the keyframes. It looks a little better. Might be a little bit fast. I'm just spreading these out a little bit. That looks pretty good to me. So I'm going to take those same keyframes and apply it to the text at the end, even though we don't quite need it yet. It's going to be somewhere down here. We can apply that to, I select 2023, I hit S to bring up scale, paste that in here so you can see that same sort of bounce motion is happening here. And then we'll do the same with the dollar value for 700. The same offset. So you can see that that motion, we can reuse it. to unhide 700 for you to see that. Okay, so the next part here is to figure out how that path works. And this is a pretty good trick, because what we're going to utilize are what's called a null follows path. So essentially, what we want to do is, just like we used trim path for the axes, we are going to do the same thing for the line chart. So once the 500 pops on there, right about here, I'm going to add a trim path to the line chart path. So let me shy some of these things that we don't need right now. So we did our text. There we go. Hopefully now you can focus a little easier on what it is that I'm working on. In the line path, I'm going to add trim paths again. And I'm going to keyframe that end here and wherever I want this to end. And then along that, it's going to grow. So I'm going to change the end to 0% at the start. And then over time, that line will grow. Let me ease these. So that's pretty fast. I might need to spread those out a little bit. Quite a bit, actually. Maybe like double that time. Looks a little better. I really want it to slow down at the end there, because I want it to call attention to that final number. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to jump into my chart, and I'm really going to stretch out where it eases into that ending value there, which will mean the change over the last few frames becomes much slower. So you can see how it slows down there at the end. Pull that out even more. I'll pull this in to give it some more time. Oops. It won't let me pull that out anymore, so I need to shrink this one to make that work. Okay, that looks pretty good. But you might see that that endpoint has been stuck on there since the start. And here's why. Because we're going to use a built-in script here to make that point follow along the end of that path. So I'm going to select point 2. I'm going to go to Window, and then I'm going to go down to this JavaScript extension here. So this is built into After Effects, and it says create nulls from paths. And we are going to, oh, actually we need the line chart selected for this first. Sorry, I forgot that, how we are actually going to parent that. Select the line chart, go to Window, create nulls from path. And then you get this pop-up window, and we are going to have, I think we want trace path. Ooh, it says no path selected. So let's untwirl this. Let's untwirl our shape. Let's make sure we select the path, and then let's trace the path. So now, exit out of this. You see we get this purple box. And this, you can see, follows along the path of that, but not at the same speed. So we have some fixing to do here. So let's go ahead and open that up. Let's check the effects. It has a trace path effect. And what we want is we want it to follow the same sort of timing of the trim path. So I'm going to turn off the loop because we don't want it to loop. I'm going to stretch this up so I can see a little more. And this is the first point in our trim path. So this is actually where I want that following to start. And it's going to end over here. I'm curious, I might be able to copy these same keyframes into that. No, it's not going to let me. So we're going to have to ease that too. And maybe play with it to make it look right. Let's open up that line chart. We essentially stretched out this point as much as we could. We pulled this one in quite a bit. There might be, it's pretty close, but it's not quite there yet. You can see where it's lagging behind that point. So I can adjust that. I can watch on here to see how it follows. Okay, so that looks like it's following along pretty well. So again, what we did was we selected our path. We went to Window. We went to Create Nulls from Path. And that gave us this, just like with our camera movement in the last video, this new blank object that we can parent things to. And you may be able to guess where this is going. What we are going to do is parent that second point to the null point. So I'm going to grab my pick whip, which is this little swirly thing on point 2. I'm going to click and drag it over to the trace paths. So now it should follow along. You can see where it's getting upset about something. It's really far offset. So let's take a look at what's happening here. I see. So because we offset our anchor point, or not our anchor point, but the actual position, let's try, I don't know why that's rotated. Let's put 0% on that. And then let's try putting it at 0, 0. And you can see where that centered that directly on that null. And now when I hit play, that endpoint follows our path. I think that's a little fast, so I'm going to stretch everything out here, and I'll show you how I'll do that. I'm going to collapse everything, unshy everything. I'm going to select all my layers here and hit pull up the graph. Oh, first I need to select all my keyframes actually. So I'm hitting U to cycle through collapsing and unhiding my layers. Essentially everything from like here on out, I want to stretch this out a little bit. So I can do that by selecting these and then pulling up my graph chart. And I can see here that everything that's moving is really from this point on, everything's going too fast. So I'm selecting those points, and I'm just going to drag this out, transform it, so that it takes up more time. Let's preview that. That start is still a little bit too fast. Okay, I'm not going to sit here and make you watch me tweak that, but you can see how I'm thinking about it. So now we essentially have the point goes along a path, and then we need to shift those keyframes where the text pops on. I really only want it to pop on as soon as that dot stops here. So I'm going to look at my scaling keyframes for 2023, and that 700 number. I'm going to place them right here. Just trying to adjust my work area here. A little too slow. Okay, that looks pretty good. So we have our path animated. The last step here would be to get that. Well, actually, let's check that with audio first. I want to make sure that it's lining up with our audio okay.
Over the past 5 years, the average cost has over the past.
You could even spread that out over a longer period of time.
The average cost has increased by 30%.
I want that to end at 30%. So let's take all of this stuff with the null and the line chart, and let's spread that out over more time. Oops, that's not what I wanted. I want these, I want these. The scale is going to need to move, and this scale is going to need to move. And I'm just going to stretch those out so they're ending at that 30% mark. So let's see if this works.
Over the past 5 years, the average cost has increased by 30%.
It's slowing down because it's trying to render it.
For the past 5 years, the average cost has increased by 30%. Over the past 5 years, the average cost has increased by 30%.
So that looks pretty good. I would slow down this a little bit and speed up the middle a little bit if it were me. But that gives you a good example of how to animate this on. The last step here is just like the last video. How do we get back to that blank slate? But if we look at the design board, you can see that I want to move from this screen to this screen. And so we want to animate our sort of blank canvas needs to be this color that we're shifting off. We could do that on our main composition, but it might be helpful to reiterate how the camera movement works. So I'm just going to do that here. So first, I'm going to add a new rectangle onto the canvas. It is nicely the right color. And then I'm going to, let's unlink this a little bit, shift this over to the right so that it's just off screen. Just a little bit more. And then I'm going to expand the X scale just so I don't have to worry about when it swipes over if it's a few pixels off. So I'm going to increase that to something like 114, 115. So that's just off screen. I'm going to name that layer, new background, and then I'm going to make everything that I want to move 3D. So really that's everything that we're looking at, including the background canvas. So I have to unlock that, 3D. And then I'm going to go to new camera. The default settings are fine here. And then new null, name this camera movement. I'm going to parent the camera to that null. And then at the end here, we're going to animate that swipe. So let's see where that is.
Outpacing inflation.
So maybe around this point, we want that to start happening. So let's animate the position on that null. And then we want this to move to the right. And you can see how it slides everything over. We're back at a blank canvas. So that looks good. I'm just going to ease these and we'll take a look at what this looks like all together.
Over the past 5 years, the average cost has increased by 30%.
Need to unhide my source. Okay.
Over the past 5 years, the average cost has increased by 30%, outpacing inflation.
It's a little slow for my taste. I'm going to speed that up just a little bit. Okay, looks good. So the final thing here, sorry, I know this video is getting long. I'm going to show you how we can piece those together in like a master composition. So I'm going to create a new composition. I'm going to name this final comp example. So we have a blank comp, and then on this, I can drag in my graph example. So you can see this is what we just made. I can drag in my title card example. If I put that underneath, you can see that is our text animation. And then at this spot, where this transitions is actually where I want the chart to start. So I want to trim down my first one and have a seamless transition to my second one. Maybe the audio off here, but you could play it over top or leave it on each individual comp.
Over the past,
so you can see how that makes that look like a seamless transition. So essentially, as we're building out our scenes, this is what we're going to do. We're going to build them individually in comps just to keep things clean so our layers don't get crazy. And then we're going to add the next scene onto the end.